Welcome back, everyone. In today's video, we'll look at my round 5 game in the Oregon Open. Now, if you remember, in my last game, I lost a very tough game to a very strong player, and I wasn't sure who I was going to get in this game. It turns out that I get a 10-year-old kid who is 1785. I'm obviously going to be expecting him to be quite underrated, so let's see how this game goes. Now, before we get into the game, let's talk about something called the kid effect. Now, what this is that opponents are scared of kids. The reason for this is because although kids are small, they're scary good. It can beat basically a lot of people, and they beat them very scarily. They just crush them tactically, and it's very scary to watch. Now, the way you beat a lot of kids is to beat them positionally, because most of the time they're really strong with tactics, but it's only later in their playing careers that they really start to crack down on positional and strategical understanding. And also another thing, you got to beat them when they're young, because once they grow up, once they have that strategical and positional foundation, they're going to be really, really good, and they're not just going to be a tactical wizard. So let's see what happens. We get e4, c5, knight f3, g6. We get the Maroczy bind after c4, and I play this knight takes d4 line. One of the ideas here is to lure the queen out so that after d6, bishop g7, and castles, I kind of have a tempo on the queen because I'm threatening some sort of discovered move with the knight. So the queen moves back, bishop e6, and you'll notice that this position is a little bit familiar, and this has of course occurred a lot of times, but in one of my recent games, it has actually occurred against Grandmaster David Brodsky. Now, at this point, the exact position is not the same, but after a few more moves, you'll see that it's very resemblance. It has a very good, it resembles it very yesly. So I moved that to d7 like I did in the game against Brodsky. We get takes, queen d4 check, and here I make one of my first improvements to that game. I play this move f6. Now f6 is mainly a thematic move, so I've traded off the dark squared bishops. I want to put my pawns on dark squares. So I play the move pawn to f6, and in this case, it's maybe less necessary than if white had already played f4, because we'll see later in the game why f6 is a good defense to f4. So we get check, f6, b3, a6. In my round 2 game at the US Open, I think the queen was still here and the pawn was here, and my opponent played f4, and I blundered with f5. Okay, now my opponent plays this move king h1, and the idea is obviously to play f4. However, with my pawn on f6, if white does ever play f4, I'm just going to make some nothing moves, just to illustrate. My opponent isn't actually threatening f5, because if my opponent goes f5, I would be very, very happy, because I can go bishop f7, just stepping out of the pin, and my opponent has carved out this very juicy e5 square for my knight. And if my opponent takes, that's even better, because I can open up the h-file. My king is very safe behind these pawns. I still have this very great square in front of the isolated pawn, and I have play on the h-file. So this would be very comfortable for me if it did happen. Okay, so in the game, I played this move rook f to c8, and it's always a decision to make which rook to move to a file, and in this case I moved rook f to c8 because usually that's what you do, but in this case I can't actually move the other rook because, well, if I move the other rook, then later in the game some nice things aren't nice anymore, so I think I'm pretty happy with this decision, at least from what happened in the game. So we get rook to c1. Now this is a mistake not because it moves the wrong rook exactly, but because it just allows me to break on the queen side with pawn to b5. This is a very thematic pawn break, especially with a6 and b5, to hack away at this pawn structure, into this pawn chain here. So you got to look at a few ideas before you play this move. You got to check that knight d5 is okay, and it is. I can simply take this pawn. I can also take with the bishop, and it looks like queen e6 is kind of a fork. However, I can just take this pawn because I believe I can simply protect the pawn since I am attacking the bishop here. Okay, and the only other thing I have to look at is pawn takes pawn, because anything else really, I just take on c4. So let's say my opponent plays, well, my opponent did play, yeah. So let's say my opponent just moves the king back, just to illustrate. I can just take this pawn, and then with this isolated pawn here, I have these good squares for my knight to jump to. This is going to be very good. I can also move the rook to the open file. I'm going to have targets for the rest of the game. So my opponent ends up taking. I take back, of course. And here my opponent has options again. My opponent can play b4 to attack my queen. Also, moves like I don't think knight d5 works anymore because I can simply take and then take this pawn again. My opponent ends up taking. My opponent ends up playing f4, which is just a mistake, and my opponent just didn't understand what had to be done with the queen side here. So f4 allows me to play b5, and this just locks in these pawns, and with the bishops on light squares, it's going to be very easy for me to target these pawns. What my opponent probably should have done is to just move this pawn to a dark square and fix this pawn on b5, so that my opponent can at least just take this pawn when he needs to. So if my opponent played b5, I was planning to play queen to b6, offering a trade, and if that trade did happen, then after bishop takes, I can not grab this pawn on a2 because then the knight would. Well, I guess my rook is protected, so if I take, and take, this would probably be a draw. However, I can play this move, after bishop takes, I can play this move rook to a3, which keeps rooks on the board and also attacks the knight. So this knight cannot really go forward, it has to go backward, and at this point I am okay to take this pawn, and then with my rook I can go back around and grab this pawn, and with the 5-on-4, whenever you have a bishop and a knight versus bishop and a knight, usually 5-on-4 or 4-on-3 is going to give you some good winning chances. But not guaranteed, but just a good winning chance. Okay, so my opponent ends up playing f4, kind of just focusing on this idea here. Again, it still isn't a huge problem. This f5, I can keep dropping back with the bishop. So I play b4, fixing these pawns here, knight to a4, knight to c5, challenging this knight, and trying to pry open this file to open up my attacks on these pawns. My opponent plays e5. This is kind of a good way to complicate the position. If I end up taking this pawn, I can run into some issues potentially after pawn takes e5 because now this rook opens up. However, I can just take this knight, and after my opponent takes this check first and takes back, my opponent here just blunders with queen takes d6. If my opponent took, probably the best move would be to take on a2 to open up this passed pawn, and then I can always take a4 when I need to, and bishop can always cover on the backwards diagonal. However, my opponent blunders with queen takes queen takes on d6, and he thinks that he's attacking two pieces here. However, I do have a couple moves to save both pieces, which means I'll just be up material. So you can try to pause the video to see if you can find at least one of them, or even both of them, and if you find both of them, try to guess which one is a little bit better. Okay, so if you said knight c5 or queen to b6 or both, it would be correct. In the game, I saw knight to c5 and I played it immediately, or I didn't really consider any other options, because I just saw that this would be cleanly winning. However, when you see a good move, you should always look for a better one. And another move is queen to b6. Now, this is probably objectively a little bit better because, as opposed to knight to c5, because here my opponent does get a little bit of counterplay after pawn to f5. Now, my opponent did not play this in the game. Instead, sacrificed the rook to get, and he was down in exchange. But after f5, there are some counterplay. I have to sort out some problems on the king side, and then only then will I be actually just cleanly up material. As opposed to queen b6, however, this attacks the queen, and if my opponent trades, then I just take back with the knight, and I am up a full piece. I'll be very, very easily winning this game. And if my opponent checks me, then I just go back. And the nuance here that you have to see to go into this line is after b takes a4, there is a skewer with rook to e8, and you would be winning the bishop here. So queen b6 might be a little bit better, but I think that in the game, even if I did see queen b6, I would only play it if I saw this move f5 after knight c5. So after knight c5, I didn't see this move f5, so I thought I would just be cleanly winning. And luckily my opponent doesn't go for f5, that would have complicated the game, but instead just sacrifices the rook, and with up in exchange, I shouldn't have that much difficulty. Foreshadowing. So exchanging queens is kind of a it's a decision that you have to make when you're up material. Sometimes the computer likes it, sometimes the computer doesn't. But from a human perspective, most of the time it does make sense to just simplify the position. Now the computer doesn't care about how simply it can win. It just cares that it wins. So if it sees that with queens on the board, you can just kill your opponent with the queen, it's going to want to leave queens on the board. But as a human, with queens on, if your opponent has a queen, there's always potential for example, an attack or even just a perpetual check from the queen. And I think we saw in my second game that my queen did a lot of damage to my opponent and eventually saved me a draw. So I decided to trade queens off. Queen e7 does force the trade of queens because it also attacks this bishop. And after a few more moves, I take this pawn. My opponent has one last trick, which is potentially checking me, and bishop to g8, which we'll see soon. I play rook to f2, attacking this pawn, check, and then after a few more moves, check, king h3, king h6, and bishop g8. This is the last trick, kind of. Rook to h7 would be a checkmate in one. However, here I calculated that it's okay to take this pawn to carve out this heir for the king. Now I could also take this pawn on g2 with check, but it does get a little bit risky because I don't have another productive check. I just have to keep checking here. King g1, and then I think the way to win is yeah, eventually I played g5. So g5 would win, but it's still kind of scary because there are moves like f5. Now, of course, I can play. I can keep pushing with g4 and h4. It looks really iffy, but I do get to pick up this g pawn. So that would be. There's really no reason to do that. Just play the simple move, no risk. Take on f4, and then after king g3, king g5. This looks like it hangs the rook to some sort of checks. But after a check, I can always block with f5. And even after h4 check and rook b5, I also play f5. So my opponent checks me, I play f5, rook b6, h4. Now I pile up on this g2 pawn. My opponent plays bishop d5. I just take the bishop. Obviously, you can try to guess what my opponent's trying to do. It's pretty obvious, especially at this level. I used to do this too. I probably wouldn't do it anymore. I can't really blame the kid. The kid's just trying to have some fun, trying to be funny. It's not, yeah. King h1, and now I do have a mate in 4, but with rook to f1 and rook to d1. I play rook b2, also very good. What I'm trying to do here is just to have my opponent take the pawn, and then with this pawn, it's never going to be stalemate. So just kind of a fail-safe approach. But after king g1, I do realize that I had this rook d1 check and rook b1. I'm threatening checkmate here. This is a very common pattern. So I'm threatening checkmate on h1. The only way to save it is to move the pawn. And then after rook to b2, you cannot stop checkmate. So my opponent does resign, or this is checkmate. Oh, I think in the game the rook was like somewhere here eventually. But okay, but I played anyhow. I played rook b2. That is check, and my opponent resigns. The rook could have blocked, but I think my opponent just resigned. So I do get this win. It was it was a good it was a pretty good game. It did have a lot of positional aspects to it, which was the goal. I think my opponent will probably it's probably gonna be my opponent's gonna learn from this game. He's gonna become really good soon. So it is good to beat these kids when they're young. Uh, there's context. Whenever I say kids, there's context to it. Okay, okay, all right. So that is round 5. I'll have round 6 up soon. See everyone in that video.